Today, we're diving into a really fascinating text that proposes a highly unconventional and honestly, deeply intriguing view on global geopolitics. We're looking at the laws of salvation, specifically focusing on a section all about the conditions of a religious nation. Now, whether you're a student of international relations, theology, or philosophy, this source material is going to challenge you to look at the world map through a completely different lens. We're going to unpack the author's unique claims about the hidden, metaphysical forces driving the conflicts we see on the news literally every single day.
So, this is the massive question at the very heart of our explainer today. We're so used to analyzing global conflicts, especially those in the Middle East, through the usual lenses, right? Territory, resources, historical grievances, political power. But the central premise of the source text we're examining argues something radically different. It suggests that these physical, earthly wars are actually manifestations of intense, metaphysical battles happening right now in the spiritual realm. Now, whether you fully buy into it or just treat it as a profound philosophical exercise, understanding this perspective completely shifts how you might consume your daily news.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Here's our roadmap for today. First, the roots of the conflict. Second, a hidden spiritual battle. Third, the problem with monotheism. Fourth, freedom versus equality. And finally, Japan's Golden Age model. Starting with Section 1, Roots of the Conflict, from Geopolitics to Metaphysics. Before we can even begin to understand the metaphysical claims of the text, we have to look at the observable, physical realities. The author doesn't ignore history at all. Rather, they use these historical touchpoints as a launching pad. The argument is grounded in very real, very painful events, pointing all the way back to the 1948 UN resolution that led to the creation of Israel. The book highlights how, from the Arab perspective, this felt like Western powers forcibly taking their land. The author then traces this through decades of wars, specifically noting the late 2008 to early 2009 Israeli military assault on the Gaza Strip. Looking at this timeline, the source material concludes that standard politics just hasn't been able to solve this endless, brutal cycle of retaliation. And it's exactly the sheer persistence of this conflict that leads the author to look beyond the physical world for actual answers.
That brings us to Section 2, a hidden spiritual battle.
Having established the earthly history, we're now pivoting to the author's controversial yet undeniably fascinating spiritual diagnosis of why this conflict just refuses to end. The text makes a staggering claim based on the author's professed spiritual investigations. The author actually asserts they've communicated with high-ranking spirits in the afterlife, specifically pointing to the spirit of the Islamic prophet Muhammad. According to the source material, this spiritual entity harbors deep, uncompromising resentment towards the establishment and existence of Israel, which heavily echoes that earthly sentiment we just talked about. The text reports this spiritual anger as the invisible fuel that's constantly reigniting the fires of conflict down on the ground. So the text frames this not just as an earthly battle, but as a massive, cosmic proxy war. On one hand, representing the defense of the Islamic world, you have the spirit of Muhammad, and on the other, defending Judaism and the nation of Israel, is the archangel Michael. The author asserts that these two immense spiritual figures are locked in this bitter clash in the spiritual realm. And because both are considered extremely high-level spirits, the text argues that their inability to compromise just reverberates straight down to humanity, making the physical wars between Israel and Islamic nations almost impossible to resolve through normal human diplomacy. And this brings us to what is probably the most urgent warning within the source material. The author observes the intense geopolitical friction we see today, especially between Israel and nations like Iran, and maps it directly onto this spiritual clash. The text warns that if this uncompromising, absolute battle between these spiritual backers continues to escalate, it seriously has the potential to ignite a devastating world final war. So, the author views the earthly friction not merely as regional politics, but as the potential flashpoint for a literal global catastrophe driven by these metaphysical forces.
Moving on to Section 3, the problem with monotheism.
So, you might be wondering, if high-ranking spiritual beings are causing this much trouble, why is that the case? Well, the author analyzes the structure of the religions themselves, and this brilliantly illustrates the point. The author uses this highly evocative metaphor comparing the rise of monotheistic religions to an inventory clearance sale. The argument is that ancient times were filled with these diverse polytheistic beliefs, but as strict monotheism rose to prominence, it acted like a massive restructuring. It aggressively swept away and erased the ancient gods of Egypt, Greece, Rome, and others.
effectively replacing a diverse spiritual ecosystem with a very strict, single-point focus.
Let's break down the consequences of this so-called clearance sale. Monotheism demands absolute adherence to a single God, right? Well, the author argues this creates an inherent inability to compromise. Think about it. If there's only one true God, other faiths are essentially invalid. Therefore, when two monotheistic powers clash, the text suggests the fighting logically has to continue until one side completely falls. To back this up, the author points to the historical erasure of older religions like Manichaeism and Zoroastrianism, arguing that the karmic history of those erased faiths still haunts the Middle East today. It creates a pretty devastating zero-sum game of spiritual survival.
Which leads us to Section 4, Freedom versus Equality.
Now, what's really interesting here is how the author begins to offer a prescription. The text shifts focus to socioeconomic philosophy with a pretty shocking metaphor. It argues that a society focused entirely on forced equality, which the author likens to totalitarianism or strict religious control, is fundamentally like a prison system. In a prison, everyone gets equal food, equal clothing, equal labor, but they have absolutely zero freedom. The author contrasts this with a free society. They acknowledge that sure, a free society allows for disparity and inequality, but the ultimate happiness of humans is higher because they possess the actual freedom to strive, to fail, and to achieve self-actualization.
This translates into a very direct plea to the Islamic world. The text suggests that relying on an ideology that prioritizes forced equality or blaming poverty entirely on the will of God actually stunts societal growth. Instead, the author strongly advocates for introducing the spirit of freedom and self-help. The argument here is that empowering individuals to work hard, innovate, and take responsibility for their own economic success will lead to way more overall happiness and prosperity than just waiting around for divine distribution or relying on state-mandated equality.
To really hammer home the need for this shift in perspective, the text offers a super relatable analogy. Religious differences often just boil down to deeply ingrained habits, like dietary restrictions. A Muslim might be physically repulsed by pork, while a Hindu feels the exact same way about beef. The author points this out to highlight a profound absurdity. Fighting absolute, bloody wars over what are essentially just different sets of rules and habits is frankly foolish. It's a very clear plea for basic human tolerance when it comes to superficial religious differences.
And finally, Section 5, Japan's Golden Age Model.
We've reached the climax of our explainer. We've seen the diagnosis of these spiritual wars and the structural flaws of monotheism. Now we reveal the text's ultimate proposed solution. The core concept proposed to save the world from this metaphysical warfare is religious harmony, and the author points directly to Japan as the blueprint. Why Japan? Well, because historically, Japan has demonstrated this incredible capacity to respect, absorb, and peacefully coexist with multiple faith traditions all at once. A person in Japan might participate in Shinto rituals, have a Buddhist funeral, and celebrate a culturally Christian Christmas, all without conflict. The author argues that this cultural ability to embrace religious plurality, rather than forcing a monotheistic inventory clearance, is the exact ideological antidote needed to cool the absolute conflicts of the Middle East.
The ultimate goal of these teachings, which are brought forth by the supreme god Cantare in the source material, is not just to stop war, but to unify these disparate religions completely. By exporting Japan's model of religious tolerance and harmony, the author believes humanity can actually avoid that devastating world final war we talked about earlier. Instead, we can enter a harmonious golden age, paving the way for a brand new space age. It is a grand, sweeping vision that ties ancient spirits directly to our future prosperity. We've covered an immense amount of ground today, from the physical timelines of Middle Eastern conflicts to the metaphysical battles of high spirits, and finally to a socio-economic argument for freedom and a plea for religious harmony. The source material presents a staggering, unified theory of global events. And it leaves us with this really provocative final thought to ponder. Can a model of religious tolerance, like the one historically seen in Japan, actually serve as the diplomatic and spiritual tool needed to prevent a catastrophic global war? It's a question that asks us to rethink everything we know about global conflict. Thank you so much for learning with me today, and keep questioning the world around you.